So why don't we go ahead and get started? Hi, everyone. My name's Nathan. I am one of the marketing managers here at Data Science Dojo. And today, or before I introduce our presenter today, I should mention again, if you have questions, use that Q&A tab. Help us keep everything organized. If you're on Zoom and you ask your question in the chat, I'm going to ask you to just move it over to the Q&A tab. If you're on any of our live streams, that would be like LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. My team members are out there. So if you have questions or comments or concerns or anything, go ahead and post them in the chat, and then my teammates will bring them over to Zoom for us. So if you have a question for Jeremy, he's still going to be able to answer that. And today, we are really excited to have Jeremy Adamson, the author of Minding the Machines. And he's going to be giving us a talk on leveraging the non-technical skills for a high-performing data scientist. So Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks very much, Nathan, and for the invitation to speak. I've been watching over the last few days the number of registrants, and just on LinkedIn, there was approaching 300, I think it was. So I'm really happy to see so much interest in this topic, and I'm not so immodest to think that it's people that want to listen to me speak so much, but I think that there's a genuine and growing interest from practitioners, from data scientists, from other folks to really improve their non-technical skills. And that makes me really excited, because I think for too long, we in the field have had the reputation of being aloof and unintelligible. And I think it's great that we're finally making efforts to fix this, to try to fix this reputation that we have. So all that to say, I'm really excited in everybody's interest, really appreciate the invitation, and I'll just hop into the material with that. So my name is Jeremy Adamson. I'm an analytics strategy consultant. And like Nathan mentioned, I wrote a book on building and leading analytics and data science teams called Minding the Machines. And actually, as of a couple of weeks ago, also the vice president of business intelligence with a company based out of Eastern Canada called the Steel Auto Group. And my goal today is to talk a little bit about how a legacy company, or if I can be impolite, a technology laggard, goes about standing up a strong data science and analytics function. So I'll go into some depth on key tips as well to consider from the non-technical aspects of the practice. So for the most part, I've kept it industry and function agnostic, but I'll pull a few examples from different companies I've worked with and past clients, different industries that I'm familiar with. In terms of background, just to give my point of reference, I came into the practice quite organically. My background, my education is actually in civil engineering, focusing on collision prediction models and traffic impact studies and project management. And then in a past life, I was actually a web developer, which gave me a little bit of coding fundamentals, I think. And I also did an MBA, which really cemented the business foundation. So I think all of these pieces kind of naturally led me on a career path that brought me to where I am today, transitioning from that engineer, from that programmer, to a value-oriented data science leader. And I've been steering my career in that direction since. The reason I give this background is that I consider myself a career transitioner rather than a directly educated data scientist, someone coming out of a computer science degree, coming out of a master's in analytics management type of program. And I think that that's a really important distinction, because both backgrounds tend to see things quite differently. They have a different lens of how they view their responsibility and the work that they do. And a lot of what I'll talk about has to do with organizations who tend to pull people from these programs, people that are directly educated, those software engineers and computer scientists. So I've been involved in the field for a little over a decade now. I've worked in marketing, I've worked in operations, strategy, finance. And along with that, I've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of different companies, a lot of different industries. I've been in the public sector, energy and resources, financial services, aviation, used cars now. So I've got to see the practice from a lot of different perspectives. And in that time, I've either created or stood up several different analytics teams and really found a bit of a niche for myself, I would say, in helping these legacy companies, again, move more towards value-driven analytics. And that's the biggest change I've seen, and the one that I've been advocating for years, is moving away from that traditional analytics mindset into that value-oriented mindset. And what do I mean by that? For most legacy organizations, traditional data science teams, advanced analytics, whatever it's called, it tends to be offshoots of business intelligence. So they tend to have that usual approach of collecting data, plug it into Tableau, give a dashboard to the decision makers. Sometimes there's a simple R Python script for ad hoc analysis. It tends to be a backroom function where they receive fully scoped out projects and deliver to the best of their ability before moving on to the next highest priority thing. And I don't mean any of this disparagingly or with the intention of oversimplifying the critical work that these teams do. Reporting is certainly essential to a business, but I do see it as an intermediate step in the evolution of the practice, both at large and in a micro lens. And the teams that are really making a difference, they're out there in the business. They're not that backroom function. They're working as advisors. They're internal consultants. They're kicking doors down, looking for opportunities. They act as a profit center for the business. They have a seat at the table. They're storytellers and artisans. And it can sound quite flowery and hyperbolic, but if you see companies who have been down both paths, it's a night and day difference. And when you see organizations that are taking full advantage of their data science function, it's magical, the things that they're able to do. But the sad part is that not a lot of companies are reaching that next stage. They've reached the limits of what reporting is able to do, what this offshoot of BI is able to do, and then they hit a ceiling somewhere in there. And there's a real gap between expectations and reality with regards to business science as a business function. And there's a study by Deloitte I reference quite often, where they surveyed a bunch of executives in North America, and those executives said, more than half, that they believe that data science is going to fundamentally change their organization in the very near future, the very way that it's operated. So great news. There's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of bold enthusiasm behind the practice. But at the same time, almost every initiative is ending in failure. And there's a few studies I reference here, and I'm sure people on the call, you've seen it yourself. Gartner, 85% of projects are failing. Tech Republic, 80%. I've seen companies, they just repeatedly put in place new leaders, new operating models, trying to make sense of this new function that they just don't understand. So people know it works. They know that it's essential to their business to be competitive in the future. But for most organizations, they're just not able to get it right. They're not able to execute. And what's the reason? The fundamental mistake, when you boil everything else away, is that these legacy companies are focusing almost entirely on the data and the technology side of things. So they're finding the smartest people they can get out of universities, these super smart, talented data scientists, and they're just letting them loose in the organization and say, go do data science, and we hope that value will naturally emerge. So they do what they're trained to do. They will get the tools in place. They will get a data lake going. They'll do the data engineering work. They'll get all of these foundational pieces in place. They've been given a blank check. There's a huge amount of optimism. Then at the end of the year, executive leadership team looks at the P&L for data science and says, oh my God, what happened here? And it varies, of course, by level of maturity. If you're talking about digital natives, this won't apply as much. But for the vast majority of companies, these legacy organizations that I've worked with, all of their processes, their business, the way that they, make money, it predates technology. All of these industries' processes were in place long before computers came along and long before decision support came along, BI. all of these predecessors to modern data science. So it's just not an area of core competency, and they're not able to guide the function, and the function isn't able to communicate. So there's this chasm of communication between the two. So it's the same for 99% of legacy organizations. The technology, the data are really the least important parts of a high functioning data science team. And if you want true value creation, I think you need to start with these three things. First off, you need a strategy that aligns to corporate strategy, has clear guiding principles. People need to know what it is that they do. You need processes that let the analytics team be successful. So it's not ad hoc, it's not random willy-nilly operations. And then lastly, and I would say most importantly, is that you need value-driven, creative, passionate people who are given the creativity to explore, to be able to find a solution that's creative and takes into account operationalization. And I'll get into a lot of points on this. But once you have all of these three in place, then you can start to talk about R versus Python and AWS versus GCP. All of that is really a footnote to the real conversation that we should be having. And this isn't escaping the notice from the big guys. I've got a couple of recent studies here from McKinsey and New Vantage Partners. Just looking at the top one, New Vantage Partners does an annual survey on what is the main challenge to becoming data-driven for an organization. And you can see it's been on the rise over time that as organizations build out their function, they're realizing pretty quickly that this isn't a technology problem. It's a process problem. It's a culture problem. And I'm sure post-COVID, if we look at the numbers for 2022, it's going to be even higher. But fully 92% are realizing that process and culture are more important than the technology. And it's the same with McKinsey. They're calling out people as being the cornerstone. People design the process, people leverage the data, people choose the technology. So everything else is downstream from the people. So just going a bit deeper on the strategy pillar, the sad fact is that most analytics teams, most data science teams, they don't know exactly what they do. They act as order takers, they act as technical resources, they wait for instructions to arrive fully formed by a stakeholder in the business and execute to the best of their ability before handing it off and awaiting further instructions. And quite often their managers don't know exactly what they do either. They've been promoted into that role because they've proven themselves as exemplary data scientists, not strong leaders, not good communicators, not people with their hands in the business, people with a seat at the table. So as a starting point, you absolutely need to know what you do. You need to know your place in the organization. You need to know how you add value to the company. And the second pillar I mentioned is process. And I say this without judgment, but most data scientists aren't career transitioners like me, aren't career transitioners like a lot of the more mature practitioners you see who have come from an engineering background, an actuarial background, who have project management fundamentals. They've come out of university programs specifically designed to attack a problem academically. So they have that traditional collect the data, analyze it, send a report, and that doesn't work in a business context. The analytics team, they can't be backroom technical folks, they can't be solely academic. They need to be BAs, they need to be strong project managers. You can't expect a perfectly clean data set and a perfectly clean problem statement. Almost certainly you're going to have neither of those, and you need to be able to work in that gray. So once we have these processes in place, it lets the practitioners focus on the creative work. They're not asking questions about what comes next. They can be razor focused on the work that they're doing. And that note about creativity brings me to my last point, which is around the third pillar, being people. And I think one of the fundamental misunderstandings about the practice, especially the perspective of stakeholders within the business, is that they see data science as purely technical. It's the same as DBAs, it's the same as software developers. And in my experience, that's completely wrong. Data science requires a very creative mindset because you're dealing with so much ambiguity. There's so much people issues, operational issues that you need to take into account to try to distill it down to using technology and programming to do mathematics and statistics, I think is very reductive. And the true value that we bring into an organization is being able to translate that business need into an analytically solvable problem. It's not the analytics in isolation. So when you think of a software developer, when you think of a DBA, they tend to receive a list of items for upcoming sprints, and they act very linearly, and they benefit from convergent thinking. So a lot of time dealing with those types of problems, they'll be able to execute on those a lot quicker. They'll be able to move on. They'll be much more productive. And that convergent thinking works for them really well, but that can be the death knell for someone that's in data science. So certainly a DBA, software developer, fulfills an essential role. And I'm not trying to say anything, again, disparagingly about them, just that it's a very different problem set than you tend to deal with in data science and analytics. So again, a ton to unpack about the needs of data scientists and how to develop talent and create impactful team conventions. But I think I'll just reiterate there that the main takeaway is we really need bright, creative, empowered, passionate people if we're going to be successful. We can work without strategy. It'll be quite ugly, but we will get something out there. Same with process. It'll be ugly, it'll be painful, but we will get something out the door eventually. But if we don't have people, if we don't have that creativity, then really the practice is dead before it begins. So with that, I'll switch gears a bit and talk about a few concrete things that an analytics team can adjust today to start adding value to the organization. And the first tip, and one that I think so many groups get wrong, is to really consider the last mile. And it's self-evident, but I think worth saying explicitly that if you create a model that isn't operationalized, if you create an analysis that doesn't impact decision-making or a report that nobody reads, you've destroyed value. And our role as data scientists is never to create these models. It's never to create reports. It's to help people make better, faster decisions at the end of the day. And everything that we do has to lead into that. This graphic comes from Brent Dykes, who wrote an amazing book called Effective Data Storytelling, and I'd highly recommend it to anybody that's listening. And what you see in blue is what happens in most cases. So the analytics team finds the data, they gather it, put it into a single table, do some fancy drawings and feature engineering, put Tableau over top and say mission accomplished. They hand it off to the decision makers and say their job is done. But the real value comes in the orange steps here. So in this case, Brent's looking at an insight generating ad hoc project. And what you're looking at here is how you communicate that to stakeholders. And that communication needs to either lead to a change in process. It needs to lead to a confirmation that this approach is the right one. We need to go down another path. Without that, without the proper communication, without handover, nothing really has happened at the end of the day. And you see it quite often in ML applications as well. We need to accept that it's not enough to have a great predictive model sitting on your desktop ready to generate ad hoc forecasts when we run that script. It's only once it's in production, once it's fed live data, once the output is being used to change process, that we can say our job is done. And that part isn't as technically glamorous. It's not as exciting for technically minded people. It has a big business advisory component. So quite often it's difficult to pull a data scientist into that world. But it's an awesome feeling once you've seen the results of your project having a real impact on the organization. So that's the last mile. It's always the most difficult one, but always the most rewarding one. You can't run a 25-mile marathon. I don't run, so I don't know if that's the correct analogy, but I'll stick to it. I think the sentiment is there. It's tip one, always consider the last mile. The second tip is that people hear statistics, but they feel stories. And I've got two contrasting exhibits on this page. If you look at the one on left here, it's an actuarial table from the 1600s. So very dry. It's clearly just reference information that's only usable by actuaries. There's definitely some interesting stuff in there. If you zoom in, there's strange cyclic death by wolves. There's the King's Evil, which is hurting a lot of people. So there's a story there if we want to tell one, but for the most part, this is pretty dry stuff. And then if you look at the one on the right, this is one of the earliest infographics, and it is a series of bar charts superimposed on London streets showing the home address of people who had died of cholera. And the centroid of all of these is a single well that was infected, that was causing all of these diseases. So when John Snow, the fella that made this graphic, showed it to people in the city, there's a story that they ran down to the well and immediately ripped off the handle. So I don't think, had he shown them what you see on left here, this dry actual table with deaths based on home address, it wouldn't have had that same impact. It's not nearly as visceral. But unfortunately, most of the output that we as practitioners put out there is a lot more like what you see on the left. And I think it's defensible to a degree by saying that we're being objective. We feel like we're presenting the data to the stakeholders, and they, in their infinite business knowledge, are better equipped to make those decisions. And I think that that's a noble position conceptually. But if we're being honest, also what we're doing in making that decision is really abdicating any responsibility for misinterpretation. It's stepping back and removing responsibility from ourselves. So we're landing in a psychologically safe place because we're putting the interpretation onto other people. And if we want a seat at the table, if we want to be respected as business advisors and not backroom technical folks, we can't be scared of taking a position. We need to be out there. We need to be face to face. We need to say what we think the data means, and to be able to work with our stakeholders to craft a story around the data. So to build a story around your insights and put as much time into the preparation and delivery as you need to make sure that you're creating change and not just pumping out models. And that leads well into number 3, is that the model is not the product at the end of the day. And this is a personal favorite of mine, and one that I have the hardest time convincing people of. But when I get auto insurance quote, what do I care about? I want it quick. I want good coverage. I want it cheap. I want it to be painless as possible. I'm never thinking, did they use a GLM? Did they use XGBoost? Did they use a decision tree to classify my risk? I don't care if it was MATLAB or TensorFlow or an abacus at the end of the day. But a lot of the time, we as practitioners, that's where our mind goes first thing. We hear a problem statement and we say, I'm going to use TensorFlow for this one. I'm going to, chart this technical path before I even explored the implications of that. And that's perfectly natural. I think every profession has a tendency to get myopic. And I've got a good engineering friend who I use in this example far too often, but he specializes in concrete for parking garages and industrial applications. So anytime I'm out with this guy, if we're in a parking garage, if we're in a stairwell, he can look around and read the life of that concrete and that stairwell based on what he sees. So he knows where it came from. He knows if they're using the wrong type of salt. He knows if it cured long enough. And it makes sense. Certainly, that's his job. That's what he spends 12 hours a day thinking about. But it's really hard for him to zoom out and to put in perspective how little thought the rest of the world puts into the mechanics of what he's doing. And that's the thing. If he's done his job well, if he's doing his best work, we never need to worry about that parking garage. We never need to look and wonder if it's going to collapse on us. We assume that someone like him is taking care of these things. And it's the same for data scientists. We don't need to get myopic. We shouldn't forget about what our organizations do. We need to be out there integrated with the business, able to put our work into context, and able to realize that it's one small part of the complete picture. And there's a parable that I'm sure you've all heard about the 3 stonecutters I believe it's by Peter Drucker, but it's been attributed to a lot of people. And in the story, three stonecutters are approached and they're asked what they're doing. And the first stonecutter says, I'm just doing my job. I'm putting in a day's work, getting a day's pay. And then the second one says with great enthusiasm, I'm being the best stonecutter that I can be. And then the third says in a very noble, inspiring way that I am building a cathedral. So what Peter Drucker says is that the first person is fine. You definitely need people like that. They're the steady eddies, the ones that keep the ship afloat. They're doing most of the legwork. He says the third person building the cathedral is the visionary, the manager. You definitely need people like that to orient people towards the big picture. But he says that second stonecutter is a problem because they are so focused on making sure that their stone cutting is impeccable that they've lost sight of what's happening around them. They don't know that a cathedral is going up, so they sub-optimize. And if you have if I can continue the metaphor, if you have a perfect, highly polished stone that's up in a place nobody can see it, it's sitting in the ceiling, you've wasted time, you've destroyed value at the end of the day. So we absolutely need academic people. We need folks who can go deep on problems, who genuinely care about the algorithms and the frameworks that we all depend on. But we can never forget, as people integrated in the business, that our companies sell consumer goods, they rent hotel rooms, they sell insurance. And the work that we do needs to support what the business does. We don't create models, we support a business, and we need to understand what it is that the business does. And then connected to that is that we should always be pursuing parsimony. A lot of the time what happens, I find, is that we can confuse having process with having procedural maturity. And they sound similar, but there's a very big distinction to be made there. We tend to get a more is better attitude. We create onerous intake forms and create a lot of friction points, a lot of hoops for our stakeholders to jump through. And then we sit back satisfied that we have created process. We have created procedural maturity, and we as a group are in a better place because of it. We can do the same thing internally with our own teams. And what always ends up at the end of this is that we start to forget to look at the decreasing marginal benefit of that next iteration. And we tweak that 90% model for a month to get it to 92%. We become that second stone cutter, and we are focused on process, we are focused on models, and we're not able to zoom out and see the bigger picture. So what is parsimony? If you look it up, it says being economical about everything you do. It's cheap, it's frugal. But there's a reason I use this $5 word when I could have just said be efficient. And I think that's because most people don't use it often, and it doesn't have any baggage with it. Everybody says things should be efficient. That's common sense. But because most people don't use the word parsimony, when you get in front of your team, when you declare, our goal is to be parsimonious, the word sticks. They might not like it, but the word sticks. And when you're in meetings and you say, is this the most parsimonious approach? Is this the most parsimonious way to solve this problem? It sticks a lot more than a common word could. And I think that this is a major issue for most analytics teams, because their goal and their training, especially for directly educated practitioners, has been to make the best model that they can. So in university, you've been given a perfectly clean data set, and you're being graded based on how high you can get that R squared, if I can oversimplify things. So make it as predictive as possible, and your job is done. But you always need to be stepping back and thinking, is this worth another iteration? If I put another week into this, if I improve performance by 5%, is that worthwhile? Or should I be spending my time on another project? And at every point, you need to be assessing if your time is being used in the best possible way. So if you're not thinking about value creation, which is going to be the next step, the next tip rather, you've entered the weeds and you need to step back. You need to be objective about what you're doing. So the models, the processes, deliverables, everything needs to be as lean as possible if you're going to create the most value in the least amount of time. If you understand the business outcome, if you work backwards to find the most parsimonious approach to accomplish that, then that's the best way to avoid becoming that second stonecutter. And there's another ugly part of parsimony that you see with a lot of analytics teams. I've got a Sankey diagram on the slide here that shows the allocation of time for a client that I worked with in the past. So fairly large team. There were several people putting in about 1,200 hours a week of work. And you can see here a breakdown of where that time went. Right away, half of it disappears to administration. There's project management, reporting, team builders and whatnot. And of the 50% that was actively working on projects, half of that disappears again into hidden data factories, a Thomas Redman concept of finding data, reconciling data, joining it, and avoidable rework. So the result is, and you see this in most cases with most clients, is that of the 30 people that were on this team, if you distill it down, only 7 of them are actually working on creating value for the organization. The rest of that time is tied up in non-value added activities. And you can't get away from some of these. You definitely shouldn't try to. But if you scale this up to think of a 1,000-person company, you couldn't have 400 people doing eminence building and team building activities. You need to be mindful all the time about where your time is being allocated and always oriented towards value creation. Which brings me to the next point, is that every activity, every model, everything that the team does should always be directed again towards that value creation. It's a term I throw around even more than parsimony. And I think another common shortcoming for individual data scientists, certainly, but teams as a whole. And I'll get into why. I don't think it's entirely our fault. And it happens to everybody at some point where you're so passionate about a project that you lose objectivity and you confuse what's cool with what's valuable. It's happened to me personally quite often in the past when I'm working on really interesting projects and I want to pull in more features. I want to get that model absolutely perfect. But at the end of the day, if the model is being used as an approximation, if it's being used to direct decisions and not part of a operationalized in production model, any polishing is, again, leading to that second stonecutter mentality. And what happens for a team as a whole is even worse. What happens quite often is that an executive makes a decision prior to the formation of the team that as a single KPI is going to be the North Star for this team. It's going to be what we rally around, what the team is oriented towards. And quite often it's going to be the number of POCs, because we know it's great to fail fast and learn. But of course, the result of that is that there's a lot of unused projects. Sometimes it's the number of collaborations. Individually, that's a great thing because we want to be collaborating a lot with different functions in the company. But what happens again is that you have a lot of collaboration, but not a lot of delivery. So it's something that we always need to be aware of what behaviors this is incentivizing. The worst one I've ever seen is the number of reports generated. So the thinking was that this team is at its absolute best when they are creating as many reports as humanly possible. And I'm sure you can imagine the outcome of that. So yeah, each of these that left, except for the number of reports generated, I would say, are the outcome of a healthy function. They aren't the objective to rally around. And that objective for a healthy team can only be value creation. And organizations, analytics teams, even we as individuals will often shy away from this. And I think it's, again, a psychologically safe position. We say there's value in this analysis that might not be financial. There's value in knowing if something doesn't work, and value creation doesn't capture that. And if I can be candid, I think it's a lot of excuses for why we're trying to evaluate ourselves on soft targets. And you can't do that in an organization. We really need to step up as a function, as individuals, and be bold and say that data science and analytics is a profit center. We're going to evaluate ourselves that way. And we ask you as our stakeholders to hold us accountable to that. And I do need to caveat that it doesn't just mean financial. It could be customer experience if we are sophisticated enough to be looking at customer lifetime value, employee satisfaction, if we can measure tenure, the cost of churn. But at the end of the day, it really needs to come back to what ELT is looking at, and that's always going to be profit. So tip 5 is always to focus on value creation. And I was going to stop at 5 because it's a nice round number, but definitely need to put this one in. So bonus tip is to be intentional about relationships. And I've said it in different ways, but warrants calling out as a separate tip because I think it's essential to getting a high-performing analytics function stood up. Said it again, our scripts and our algorithms, definitely important, but they are just the way that we help people make decisions. And it's critical, I feel, that we recognize that the ultimate outcome of data science and analytics is people helping people make decisions using technology. And if we're going to help people make those decisions, we really need to know them as people. They need to know us. There needs to be mutual understanding. We need to get away from this conception of us that I mentioned at the beginning as being distant and aloof and unintelligible. We need to be seen as empathetic people who are there to help our stakeholders. And empathy isn't a word you hear quite often in data science discussions, but I think it's one that we need to be hearing and saying a lot more often. And I think the first step to being empathetic is to realize that practitioners make people in the business uncomfortable. And you can't have empathy without acknowledging that. And the reason behind that really is that there's a huge amount of information asymmetry between the analytics function and the business. And quite often we just expect that the business is going to learn our vocabulary, learn our language. They're going to be the ones that have to accommodate us. But I think it needs to be us that reach across the aisle and learn about them, learn about their constraints to be able to deliver a solution that makes the most sense for them. I always use the parallel of a doctor. If you think of when you go to a doctor, when you go to a dentist, it's a very similar situation in terms of information asymmetry. So they have their own lexicon, they review your blood work, they will come back with some very brief instructions or a prescription, and then they move on. And then you don't see them again. You don't get to interact with them. They're distant and unknowable. So maybe I'm projecting a bit, but whenever I enter into an engagement with a doctor, I begin immediately in a defensive mode. I review all the results, I go through the blood work, I Google everything, and I go into that exchange knowing that I'm outgunned, but I'm ready to do my best to make sure I get the most I can out of that 5 minutes I have. And that's not a healthy emotional posture to enter into that exchange with. The doctor's there to help you. And the best doctors are the ones that are understanding your concerns. They're trying to get to know you. They explain the results in a way that you understand. And the advice they give, the prescriptions they give, is tailored to you as an individual, not just you as an abstraction. If you have young kids at home, they're not going to say sleep more, reduce your stress. They're going to cater that solution to your unique situation. And that's the same situation that analytics teams are in, and the way that we need to interact with our stakeholders. We can't just swoop in like that aloof doctor and give a prescription and fly off to the next project. We need to understand their constraints. We need to understand their point of reference, their personal motivations, their professional concerns. And this can and will come up organically over time if you're an in-house analytics team. Over the years, you might get to know people, but the best in class are the ones that are really intentional about this. And they're setting goals for themselves and as leaders for their teams to really be intentional about building relationships. Make it a goal to meet as many people as you can, to understand the pain points that they experience, how they interact with the data, what the concept is of your team and the organization, and really how you can help each other. Because at the end of the day, it is a service function, and we need to be in a service mindset to be at our best. So tip 6, the bonus tip, is to be intentional about relationships. So that's the material I had for today. I hope it's been valuable. And if I can distill it down into just a few takeaways, you really need to make sure that analytics and data science is aligned to corporate strategy and that the work is always directed towards value creation. Not technology for the sake of technology, but the leveraging of technology to create business value. And anything that doesn't translate into business value should be mercilessly cut away. And in that vein, we need to remember that we are in a service function. We need to be oriented towards those ends, and we need to see relationship building, customer experience, relationship management as much a part of our job as the actual model development. And then lastly, and most importantly, is that technology is just a tool at the end of the day. We're here to help people make decisions, and we use technology, we use coding to do that. And we always need to be mindful that we're focusing on the human elements and the business outcomes, and then we're working backwards to find the most simple approach that we can to enable that. We're not technology for technology's sake. Technology is in our toolbox, and we are people first. So thanks very much to Data Science Dojo for the invitation and for everybody on the call for joining. If any of this has resonated with you and you don't mind a shameless plug for my book, Minding the Machines goes into a lot more detail on everything that I've discussed, and it's available on Barnes & Noble, Chapters, Amazon, wherever books are sold. And lastly, I absolutely love talking about this stuff, if you can't tell. So please feel free to reach out. I've got my contact information here. Happy to connect and bounce ideas off each other, and I'd love to hear what you've thought of this. And if it's helped and if it resonates with the experience that you're having in your organization. So that's my time. Thanks again so much. And I believe we have some time for questions. Nathan, thank you.
I'm still muted. I can't get out of this virtual society where I mute and unmute myself. It looks like we do have one question. So how does your MBA play into your career as a data scientist?
How does it play in? I would like to say that the technical part helped and the financial classes and all that, but I think what it gave me exposure to was an understanding of the life of people that are in different functions. If I can be immodest, when I went into my MBA, I thought, you know, I'm an engineer. I've done something much harder than business, and I was immediately humbled. I had to rely on people from marketing. I had to rely on people from HR, all of these functions that I thought were soft and nebulous. And I realized that there is so much value in their perspectives and in their working life that I didn't really appreciate until I met them and got to know them individually. So it probably says a little more about me than it should, but I think that humbling experience of realizing that I don't know it all, and they have a ton of constraints and focuses and desires that I didn't understand was huge for me and really helped me to be more empathetic.
Well, we have two more in the Q&A tab that are pretty long. If you want to open that tab up and give them a read. And sorry, Vinod, I think I'm going to butcher your name here, but Vinod asks, from my experience, focusing too much on business value can lead to short-term solutions that help the stakeholders make decisions. How would one encourage leadership to invest in solutions and architecture that give long-term value?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you need to find a balance there. The truth is somewhere in the middle. If you're working with a publicly traded company, they're working quarter to quarter, they need to report. You need to be able to prove immediate value for what you do. If you have something that's a surefire win that's going to take 5 years, maybe you can convince them to, add some points under your column a little earlier on in that. But I think you need to always be aware that you are being evaluated quarter by quarter, month by month, year by year. And you can't say, I'm only going to add value over the long horizon. You need to be able to prove that immediate value. And sometimes that's not glamorous. Sometimes that's VBA scripting to automate an ugly Excel file. And then sometimes that's going to be a really transformative long-term project. But if you go too far down either one of those, you're going to be heartbroken one way or the other. So I definitely agree with the sentiment. I would just always caution people not to look exclusively at the long term, because you're being evaluated day by day as well. And if you're going to build credibility in the team, you need to be able to prove continuous value.
And then it looks like we have from anonymous attendee. In the case where a new engagement is being started, do you consider the best approach to try framing some of these value creation ideas, essentially start the conversation at the last mile?
Absolutely. I think under the process pillar, one of the key things to come up with is a very systematic way to do intake and prioritization, because teams are always getting pulled in 100 different directions, and quite often it's on non-value add activities. So what I see quite often is there's a mixture of prioritizations. You will go based on seniority. So a VP and a director ask you for something, you do the VPs first. So you're incentivizing them to escalate. So now you have two VPs asking for something. And then it's based on urgency over top of that. So one's due Tuesday, one's due Thursday, you do the Tuesday first. So now you're incentivizing the director who needed it on Thursday to get a VP to say it's due Tuesday. So what happens in trying to find the systematic, safe way to prioritize is you've incentivized the most aggressive, stressful behavior in your stakeholders. But if you can align ELT and business leaders around value creation and come up with a systematic way to do prioritization, which is usually profit at the end of the day, if you can pull in customer lifetime value, employee churn costs, if you can really distill that down, then you have a good systematic way that doesn't encourage bad behavior in your stakeholders, and lets you focus on those value add activities and be able to continuously prove value, so that you're not bolding lines in Tableau or whatever else people are asking for.
All right, and from Stephen, how did these principles inform your experience in aviation with value creation versus safety principles?
That's a good point. You definitely have to be looking over everything you do with a healthy risk management framework. And it's not enough to wing it, if I can use an aviation expression. It's not enough to just wing it and hope for the best if it's mission critical stuff. So you need to really look at all boundary conditions. You need to sit down with the risk management specialist. You need to document every potential issue that could come up, every way that you're going to mitigate it, and understand whether or not it's worth pursuing. On the technical side, of course, no knife edge cutovers, running things in parallel, and only as you're comfortable making gradual transitions for key parts of whatever process you have in place. But that said, most of my work was on the marketing side, so not mission critical and nothing that would keep a plane in the air. So.
All right, and then a couple more questions, and we'll let you go.
Right.
What's your advice for transitioning folks who are lost and have no clue, and guide on how to get into BA?
I get that a lot, and it's difficult because there's a huge talent crunch right now. If anybody's looking for work, you will have recruiters reaching out nonstop. But there's also a lot of churn. So everybody is constantly looking for that new role, and people tend to stay in analytics roles maybe a year, 2 years. So it's very high churn, and you're always competing with a lot of great people. And it's very difficult to compete in a solely technical way. There's always going to be someone out there who has the exact intersection that you don't have. They've worked in aviation, they've worked in marketing in aviation, they've worked with the specific tool set, and they have Python, and they have Tableau. They have the exact tool set somewhere in the world. And with working remotely, you can't compete exclusively on that. The only way I found for people to really stand out is by nurturing and cultivating those personal skills and being able to articulate the business value that they've added where different organizations they've been at. The best people that I've worked with haven't been the most technically astute ones, they've been the ones that have just been able to get stuff done. And that's a very different skill set. And if you can prove that, then I think that's the best way to get into an organization, is really showing that you're willing to get things done.
Yeah, be a problem solver.
Exactly.
And then 2 more questions. How did you manage your career change into data science in gaining your first working role without experience?
Yeah, I would like to say it was based on something amazing I did, but if I'm being honest, it was luck. My first opportunity was with the government of Alberta when I was working on a collision prediction model, which overlaid a capital planning system. And at the time, there wasn't any data science to speak of. I think it was called decision support systems. But that experience was something that I leveraged to get into my next role at Suncor, an oil and gas company, where I started analytics team in their logistics function. And then from there, I leveraged all that experience to get into WestJet. So I was one of those people that jumped every 18, 24 months, always leveraging everything that I learned to make that next step. And I think in this high churn practice, you really need to be willing to be uncomfortable and to make those leaps into new industries, new functions, and always be learning as much as you can and building that network. My network has helped me immensely, I would say. I've never got a job just by sending in a resume and crossing my fingers. It's always been based on people that I've known.
All right, and final question before we let you go. I think it's simple yet a little deep. How do you nurture your motivation?
I've been lucky. I landed in something that I genuinely love doing, and like I mentioned, I've been an engineer before this. It was fine. It was a paycheck. I didn't love it. I've been a web developer. It was a paycheck. It was fine. And then when I did that job that I mentioned with the government of Alberta, that overlay of capital planning, collision, put a light bulb over my head, and motivation has never been a problem since. I work full time at this. When I'm not working about it, I'm thinking about it. I'm writing books about it and giving talks about it. So I'm very lucky in that I landed in a job that I love.
All right, and I lied. We have a couple minutes left, so Grace, we'll get to your question, and then we'll hop off. So, has your career transitioning been a negative for employers?
Never. I always have somebody ready to fill in behind me and never leave a role unless I am 100% disposable. So from day one, I have a succession plan in mind. I'm gearing somebody up. I'm making myself as disposable as possible so that I'm able to move on to that next opportunity. And I'm always upfront with people. I can come in, I can build this for you, but I'm not an operations guy. I'm a builder, and I will hand the keys off to somebody that I'll train. But I know what my role is and where my value is, and usually people are quite accepting of that. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Be sure to check out Jeremy's book, give him a follow on Twitter, LinkedIn, reach out to him with an email if you have more questions. This webinar is recorded. It will be up on our website and our YouTube channel momentarily. Next week on May 4th, and I believe it is at 11 a.m. Pacific, we will have a crash course on the nave Bayes classification. So be sure to join that next week, May 4th, 11 a.m. Otherwise, be on the lookout for this webinar on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. Jeremy, thanks again, and we hope to see you real soon.
Great. Thanks for having me. Thanks,
everyone. Bye.